Assalamu alaikum. My name is Paul Williams, and I'm joined by our Director of Student Services, Ahmed Abdul Salam. Now, today I'm delighted to welcome you to a special taster session for our upcoming diploma in Islamic psychology with renowned neuroscientist and theologian, Dr. Francesca Bocca. Francesca has a PhD in systemic neuroscience from the University of Munich in Germany and a diploma in Islamic psychology from the Cambridge Muslim College in England. She's also the director of the Ibn Rushd Islamic Studies Institute, the first Italian language madrasa for children and youth. So I've said my bit. So over to you, Dr. Francesca. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. It's really a pleasure to see you, Paul. A pleasure to see you, Ahmed, and everyone else I haven't met yet. So welcome, all of you. Inshallah, this evening, the purpose is to serve as a taster session. So to show you some of the topics that we will go through in the course, although this is a separate lecture, it's not something I will repeat at all. But it will give you an idea of the spirit that we are going to maintain in the course. And then, inshallah, I'll leave some time to answer your questions and to help you figure out exactly what you're going to do in Islamic psychology. But let's start with our class first. And the title that I've chosen is The Direction of Psychology. And this is something I figured not many people talk about, the fact that psychology has a direction. It is not a neutral path we're taking. Psychology is a very applied science. It's an applied science, well, usually in the clinical setting, we're aiming at people feeling better in the most generic sense possible. And so therefore, we have to take a sequence of choices that would bring people to feel better. And we have to give them direction, to guide them through direction, but not only in the clinical sense does psychology have a direction. It also has one in the way it sees itself, in the fields it's going to touch upon. And we will discuss some of it from a comparative view in today's class. And I think in some ways it's going to be a little bit multidimensional. So I've chosen this artwork by Olafur Eliasson. It's called the 360 Compass. And I tend to use art a lot to communicate ideas in the course. So yeah, that's just the beginning. And it gives the idea of the fact that we're not just looking at something bidimensional, just Islamic versus Western, which is, I think, sometimes a little bit of a simplification that we do when we're talking about this discipline. We say, okay, well, there is Islamic psychology. What about the Western one? And although sometimes it can help us getting some ideas of the framework, the reality is that we are moving in so many different directions and on so many different entities and levels. And it can be confusing fast, but it can also be quite fascinating fast. So I hope I'm conveying the second. There is this super famous poem that everybody knows of Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. And this is an art which is taken from it. It's called Two Roads Diverged by Kelly Hendrickson. The point here is that in psychology, we are continuously choosing a path in many senses. And we're choosing a path in the way we understand ourselves, first of all, or at the level we are going to look at the person, or whether we're going to label what the person is telling us simply as therapeutically valid, something normal or abnormal. Of course, no psychology speaks in that term, but it's a simplification. And as in the poem of Robert Frost, two roads diverged in the woods, and I took the one less traveled by. So that's what we're going to do, because indeed, Islamic psychology is not a road which is well trodden until now. It is something that, although it has a very long history, and in the course we are going to go in very much detail about the glorious history of Islamic sciences and Islamic psychology in particular, most of it has been forgotten. So this is not very traveled as a path. And in psychology, again, we use traveled because we are walking. We are walking all the time with intent, with direction, walking, traveling. And there's no coincidence that in the Arabic, the term suluk is very much used as well to talk about many of the points that Islamic psychology talks about. Suluk is really traveling the road, is the way we conduct ourselves, the way we walk. And this is actually what every session of psychology, of psychotherapy is eventually about, walking the walk. But walking is not only important to progress, but direction is important too. And sometimes in the so-called Western psychotherapy, which we will say later that it doesn't exist, but for now it still exists in our lesson, we can say that sometimes what is important is the progress and not the direction. What do I mean? Well, in psychotherapy in the West, there is very much the myth of, at least you're progressing. There is some change. Something is going on. You're not stuck. We're very much afraid of being stuck in the West, right? We want to be productive, to do things, to change, to experiment everything. Yet, what the overview of Islamic psychology will bring us is that our orientation is more important than the actual amount of kilometers that we have gone through or how long we have run for. And I'm not talking something generic about an Islamic psychology that comes much later, but this is actually something that we can find in the same Quran. So if our first question is, where are we walking if we're talking about walking? And we have a very powerful Quranic reminder on the topic. It's from Surah At-Takwir, verse 26, فَأَيْنَ تَذْهَبُونَ? And this is, so where are we going? Where are we progressing? What is our destination? And even though this ayah is originally revealed talking about the non-believers, the fact that they are going everywhere, right, with their life and not really following a path, a direction. It can metaphorically, when talking about Islamic psychology, also be generalized to all of us. So where are we going? Where do we want to go? And this is something that in Islamic psychology has to be reminded to all of us, not just in session, because we will see Islamic psychology is not the thing that we do with the client on the couch. It's an everyday work that people do, whether with a therapist or not. And the course, that is why actually we have decided also to offer a course for the general public on Islamic psychology. And we were very clear that we do not want only people that are specialists or therapists, because we want the everyday person, the everyday Muslim, to be able to apply these tools in their life and then to bring them out in their community. Because we're living right now in Islam, in the Ummah, a mental health epidemic in which people are using Western terminology, therapy lingo to explain the world. So everybody has a trauma, everybody is triggered, everybody needs to set boundaries and all these sort of things. While we have our own indigenous terms and our own framework to see reality. And we're losing out on that. So that's why we need to disseminate the knowledge of Islamic psychology to the wider public. And this is a very urgent task for Muslim. So what I'm going to do in this class is basically to understand the direction of Islamic psychology. And of course, this would be a very long topic. So the way we're going to do it is that we're going to take 9 schools of Western psychology. And for each of these schools, of these approaches, we will understand something that will help us figure out the direction of Islamic psychology, whether by contrast or harmoniously, or sometimes they coincide, or sometimes we will find new insights on Islamic psychology from it. And then, of course, this is a very different approach than the one we're taking in the course, where we are building, let's say, top down. So starting from the Quranic text, from the hadith, to the theology treatises, to the classical knowledge. Where is Islamic psychology? Well, this evening we're doing it in a different way, just to have bits and pieces and bites of information that then we can, inshallah, bring in our everyday life. Usually, Muslims do not like psychoanalysis a lot. And this is a fact that has many reasons. Well, one reason would be that psychoanalysis tends to overly sexualize the human being, and that's something we don't like too much in our community. Another reason might be that the vision of the human being that emerges from Freud is very pessimistic. And in Islam, we like to have a positive view of the human being and their dignity. And there are many other reasons that could make it, but actually there have been Muslim psychoanalysts. That's a very interesting branch of how things went. And today we are going to start from psychoanalysis to gain some knowledge on Islamic psychology. So when I talk psychoanalysis, I'm talking Sigmund Freud, I'm talking the late 19th, early 20th century. And usually here, the goal of this school is to make the unconscious conscious. So to resolve the inner conflicts that we have inside ourselves, they usually always start from early childhood. And that's another reason why in general in Islam, we don't like them too much, because we don't like to be stuck in the past. We like to, live in the moment, being Ibn al-Waqt, the son of the instant in our approach. And however, in psychoanalysis, we have very interesting techniques. Some we do use, for example, dream analysis. It's a very interesting content commonality, although it's made differently, but also free association, just saying words and coming to several meanings. And we can say that Islamic psychology does recognize unconscious and internal forces, although many people do not know that. Although in classical Islamic psychology manuals, for example, the ones by Al-Ghazali, the struggle is called differently. It's nafs versus qalb, let's say. So the self against the heart, rather than the id or the s against the ich or the ego, as Freud did frame it. So the point that we are going to learn from the comparison with psychoanalysis is that while psychoanalysis is focused on a single moment of catharsis in which you free yourself from your past, Islamic psychology is more based on a continuous work of tazkiyatul nafs, purification of the self. And while the S is always destructive, the nafs, if it is trained, it can become your best ally. Your nafs can become something that is in peace with your heart, with your spirit, that guides you towards good. A second very well-known school is behaviorism. Behaviorism is about early mid-20th century. It's mainly American school. And the therapeutic goal here was, let's change people through simple conditioning. So basically, everything is a habit. Everything is learned. We can teach people anything. We can make anything out of people. So the most famous quote in behaviorism is this: give me a dozen healthy infants, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. And at a certain point in one version of the quote, even say he can make any person a thief if he wants, with correct training. However, this brings us to a very key contrast with Islamic psychology. And that is the fact that we do believe that there are people guided for good and some that are not. And we cannot make everyone a saint, or we can't make everyone what we want. And we have the very famous hadith that is the basis of this in Sahih al-Bukhari, in which it's a very long hadith, in which the formation of the embryo and of the human being is discussed, and there are successive phases in the quantity of 40 days. And in the third branch of time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends an angel who is ordered to write 4 things: to write down the deeds, the livelihood, the date of death, and whether he will be blessed or wretched. And the interpretation is in religion. But again, this is an interpretation. So in one sense, we could say that inside a certain person, there is a strong predisposition. And the debate between qadr and free will is something that, of course, if you know Paul, you know a lot about it, because it's one of the classical topics of Islamic theology, right? So I think most people here are familiar with that. But if we try to look at it, not from a theological side, but from a psychological side, what we see is that we do not only behave because of stimuli that we see. Our behavior also are a reflection of our spiritual life. And Islam affirms that you can modify your behavior. So all the manuals on Tazkiyah include a lot of steps actually on that. And we will see it during the course. We will discuss the 6 steps to change ourselves. And these are something that is not like modern coaches lingo. It's something from 1,000 years ago. So this is something is very documented in Islamic psychology. But at the same time, there is something inside us that is not just a response to external circumstances. Another key school of psychology is Humanistic Therapy, and we are getting closer and closer in time. So this is more recent, is from the 1950s, 1970s, and the founders here are very famous: Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow. Maslow is the guy of the pyramid of needs, very famous stuff for psychology students. And here their idea moves, and they say, well, actually the duty of a psychologist is to foster in the client self-actualization, congruence between their self-image and their experience. So their self is the key. And the techniques here are something that is very familiar to the stereotype of the psychologist today. So client-centered therapy, unconditional positive regard, active listening. And again, some of these skills we do use in Islamic psychology as well. And there are papers that have been written about how the Prophet ﷺ practiced active listening in the most perfect form, by orienting his body, by looking in certain ways. And these are things that we do practice. And when we compare it with Islamic psychology, we see that Islam actually would criticize an excessive focus on self-actualization. It is too much ego-centered. Where we find actually our meaning, our purpose, is not through self-interest, needs, wants, the lower nafs, even our identity. This term we use so much, the Muslim identity, the Ummah identity, but this is useful. But this is not the top of the pyramid, or well-being even. And this is shown in the Quran in so many stories of the prophets. And if you read again the stories with a psychological lens, you figure out that Yusuf alayhi salam in the well does not have a need of good sleep to praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or that all prophets in difficulties had their focus concerned towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only. But for us, that we're not prophets, so how can we psychologically adhere to this? And there are many treatises, many classical authors. Again, when I'm talking about it, I'm comparing it to medieval Islamic psychology. I remark this a lot because if you study psychology at a Western university, they're going to tell you psychology started in 1879 in Leipzig, Germany by Wilhelm Wundt. And if there is one thing I want you to remember from this class is that that's not the case. So that's Western psychology. But psychology as a thing in Islam, in the Islamic world, was well developed, pervasive, and really something completely developed and solving all these type of issues, or talking about all these type of issues. So the answer to that are treatises on ubudiyya. What is ubudiyya? Sounds like ibadah, right? So is the attitude of the human being which realizes themselves in servitude towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are treatises of it by Ibn Taymiyyah that are very famous, by Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali that are very famous, classical scholars of Islam. Also, we're very fluent in Islamic psychology. That's another take-home message. We all know Ghazali, the theologian, but do we know Ghazali, the psychologist? We all know Ibn Taymiyyah, the theologian, but do we know Ibn Taymiyyah, the psychologist? Or we know Ibn Sina, the doctor, but do we know Ibn Sina, the psychology? Or Ibn Rushd, the philosopher, but also Ibn Rushd, the psychologist? This is very important. And then we have, well, the most widespread approach nowadays is cognitive behavioral therapy. When we go to an average psychologist in the West, well, this is what most probably they would do. And here the idea, it starts in the 1970s, this approach. The idea is that when you're not feeling well, you have dysfunctional thoughts. So we can modify these thoughts. We can modify what we believe and the patterns of our thought. And this will alleviate the distress. So the type of techniques we use in CBT is, for example, thought challenging, exposure for phobias, for example, or behavioral activation. And here we find actually a similarity in this strategy, because this is very similar to something else which we know as Islah al-Nafs, so reforming the nafs, also in Tazkiyatul Nafs, also in many other disciplines, we will find that sometimes we have to change the way we think. There are several sicknesses of the heart in classical Islamic treatises. For example, ingratitude, right? How do we cure that? By focusing on the positive, by looking at things from another light. And this is all principles that were outlined more than 1,400 years ago in Islamic psychology. At the same time, CBT is not used enough, we can say, in the West. Why? Because one would seek a CBT approach only when they have symptoms. And what are symptoms? Well, they are the ones defined in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual for Mental Health Disorders, and we will talk very critically about it in the course, inshallah. But what is the problem here? That Islamic psychology does not only apply to people that are sick. It applies to all of us, because all of us need to improve our thoughts. All of us need to improve the way we see the world. For sure, we're not always optimistic. For sure, we're not always grateful. For sure, we're not always patient. So Islamic psychology does something a bit similar to CBT, but it does it continuously. And that's why you're supposed to be doing daily your muhasaba, and then we will discuss in the course what that is. But you don't go once a week to the psychotherapist. You do the work once a day. And again, I know this is interesting for those of us that are converts, right? Because people always are surprised of how much more work Islam is. So you don't just go like to church once a week, you pray 5 times a day. And the same thing for Islamic psychology. Right? It's actually more work because it requires constant attention, constant presence, the state of dhikr, basically. What it is in ibadah, the action of dhikr. In Islamic psychology, it has a different level of it. Is to be always conscious. So while CBT only looks for thoughts and behaviors that are maladaptive, meaning they don't adapt well to the environment, we look for ihsan. We look for perfection. This is another interesting therapy, the gestalt therapy. The name is from German. It means shape, form. And it's from the 1940s, 1960s. Nowadays, not too much used. But the idea here is super interesting, because the idea is if I am aware of the present moment, then my parts of the self will integrate each part of our self, which find a place. This school is not very much used, but one thing is very famous of it is the empty chair. You have seen it for sure, is the stereotype of therapy, right? Where you talk to the empty chair and it's like your father or whatever. That comes from here. And techniques like role play or body awareness are very much used. And the founder said that in therapy, they basically do this. I do my thing and you do your thing. I'm not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you're not in this world to live up to mine. So when we compare this with Islamic psychology, we again find some striking resonance and some things that do not really fit together. The striking resonance is the idea of focusing on the present. This is so important. Many psychotherapists and many psychologists do not really understand the power of the present, and so they let their client delve in the past so much that they self-destroy, or they delve in the future so much that they overplan and they burn out. But being in the present is the only moment in which you have an option, because you don't have an option for the past and you don't have an option for the future. That's the reality. Now you have the option of choosing good or choosing evil. So this Gestalt's present moment focus sounds a bit like hudur, the presence of the heart that we should have during worship and during everyday life. But at the same time, in Islamic psychology, we would critique this amount of individualism. The idea, I do my thing, you do your thing, and so what? We're just two people, and so what? This will not satisfy us. So our focus would be in the present moment to align with the divine will. Existential therapy, this for those of you that are more into philosophy, no existentialism for sure. This is really not for the faint-hearted as a school of psychology. It really makes me anxious every time I hear or read something about it. And I've put for you some of the art that was inspired by existentialist philosophy. If you don't know it too much, that's Escher, Bacon, and Monk, and makes you understand it's not really a chilled type of approach to existence. And this is a movement that starts from the 1950s and arrives up to now. And the therapeutic goal is that you should confront existential givens, death, freedom, meaning, and you should live authentically. And this is really difficult. And in the Islamic framework, what I really appreciate of Islamic psychology is that we can talk about these themes, death, freedom, and meaning, without the anxiety. So the palette would look very different from this. And that's because the sense making that Islam does of these realities really gives us, of course, there is a weight, but there is at the same time, a sort of tawakkul that makes the possibility of existence not something as scary. So we do not prepare for death, like the existentialists say. We do prepare for after death, which I think is a bit of a key difference. And as Nietzsche said, which I know is not the best Islamic motivational speaker, but it's an author that I really read in a different way. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. And I think that is really deep wisdom of what he said. And we know that knowledge is the lost property of the believer in Islam. So we can take this to understand why are these existential realities bearable in Islam. And then we do have psychodynamic, the modern psychodynamic. So not Freud anymore, but this is taking from his students like Jung, Adler. And here the idea is still to be in the unconscious, but to add to it, improving emotional insight, relational patterns. So the techniques is not only dream interpretation and these very unconscious things, but also exploring the relationship, the attention to the dynamic of the relationship between the therapist and the client. And the most interesting author here is for sure Jung. Here you can see two images of his famous Red Book. And the Red Book is actually like a medieval manuscript that he did by hand at a certain point in his life. It's exactly like a medieval miniature, but he did it out of the blue. And some say it was a psychotic episode. Most probably it was, because many people with psychosis, like schizophrenics and so on, do develop a talent for art at a certain point in their life. And again, from an Islamic view, many things are continuous. So there isn't like normal and crazy, but we could go a person who is very boring, a person who's creative, a person who's too creative, a person who's slightly slightly lost it, and then fully blown psychotic. And we are all somewhere there in this middle. So Jung tried to explore very deep metaphysical aspects. So what is actual reality? What are the kingdoms of existence? He said there is invisible forces. And I know many Muslims do really creep out and start going all jinn on this type of things. The actual thing is that in reality, there are many hidden forces. And this was created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there is the visible and the invisible. There is, the matters that we can touch. And then there is electricity we can sort of not much control. And then there is even more invisible than that. And in Islamic psychology, one of the advantages is that we operate with a clear metaphysical approach. And this helps people finding a balance, finding their place in the world. And this is not given for granted outside it. It is not so clear that there is the realm of human beings, and then the realm of the ruh, and then there is the realm of the divine attributes, which is somewhere else. And all these things are not very well known outside of Islamic psychology. So sometimes people get confused and mistake internal and external, spiritual and non-spiritual, dark and light even. So this is something very interesting. And this is an image of the door of Jung actual house, which is now a museum in Kusnacht in Switzerland. And it is saying in Latin, it says vocatus aque non vocatus Deus aderit. And it's very interesting because it means that called or non-called, God is present. And this is a dimension that the psychodynamic approach has, and many other schools of psychology don't have, which is working, keeping in mind the divine. Now, the way it's done, it's less than ideal, of course, but this is a common ground, because in Islamic psychology, also whatever we work on, so whether we're working on a family crisis, whether we're working with an eating disorder, whether we're working with OCD, God is always present. And that is what can give meaning to tragedies. Of course, this is not spiritual bypassing, just pray it out or pray more and things will solve out. There are techniques and there are ways, and it's a science. But it's an interesting point of continuity. And then we have dialectical behavioral therapy. This is one of the most recent ones. It was born in the 1990s. And the idea is to help people, like, it's dialectical, so it's through discussion and through talking, but the actual objective is radical acceptance. So the idea here is that when you have a pain in your life and you do not accept it, then this means suffering. And from this simple equation, they're basically saying that if you remove non-acceptance out of the equation, you will not suffer. And if this sounds like Buddhism to you, indeed it is. That's correct. That is a Buddhist idea. So the idea that acceptance is the entrance to change and is an exit to suffering. This is what really informs this school. And the founders had quotes, for example, like, I accept you as you are, and I'll help you change with it. So I like to discuss this school with you for two reasons. One reason is that dialectical behavioral therapy is basically cognitive behavioral and Zen Buddhism. And the Buddhists were very good at informing psychotherapy through their religion. In Islam, we have not been that good yet. So there isn't a well-known psychological school that is informed by Islam in the same way. Many Muslim psychotherapists do not practice Islamic psychology. They know nothing of the things that you will know in the course. They just are Muslims and they study psychology in the West, and that's just happened to be. But Islamic psychology, as you might start to figure out, is something else. So this is an example that actually by just informing a therapy with our religious knowledge, then a school, an approach can be done, and this can be helpful to everyone. This is another big key, because Islamic psychology, let us keep this in mind, is not psychology for Muslims. It's not the halal psychology, right, with the stamp. That's not what it is. It is an understanding of the self that can heal the self of humans. Because it's psychology. It's ilm al-nafs. Who has a nafs? Everyone has a nafs. So this is a super powerful reminder that the knowledge that we derive from Islamic psychology can benefit everyone. Again, another aspect of it is that this acceptance is also one of our key virtues in Islamic psychotherapy. But we tend not to see acceptance as the whole package, but it's generally balanced between, on the one hand, rida, so contentment, acceptance, and on the other hand, muhasaba, so self-accounting. So we shouldn't just be passive, but also active. And this is really key of the step further than this. So we do not just accept whatever comes. We work and examine our work, and we accept whatever comes at us. And this is really powerful and is really a proof to anything that it can face it. And then the final school that I'd like to discuss with you is acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. This is founded in the year 2000, so it's the most famous school of psychotherapy, very famous. Almost everyone incorporates some aspects of it. On social media, it's everywhere, these sort of ideas. And here the idea is, let's encourage people to be psychologically flexible. How? Accepting thoughts and committing to value-based actions. So what you do in this therapy is that you clarify things with the client. You make them really express what are their values, and they should commit to their values. They should really say who they are, and then they act according to it. Coherence, mindfulness are the keys here. So the goal is not to eliminate the difficulty, but to be present with the difficult feelings. And these I have put some images of Stoic authors, because I find this approach very similar to classical Stoicism. So the idea that dignity and honor stays in bearing what comes to you. And this is not talking anymore about dignity and honor, because nobody cares about these things anymore in the West, but it is about you will be happy, you will feel good, whatever that is, through acceptance. But it's basically the same sort of idea. And this again resonates a little bit with our tradition. However, the value system that the human being can live acceptance through, for us, is not chosen at random, but is through the prophetic sunnah. So it's through the Sharia. And this stability is also a key of what in their therapeutic process can serve to the person to have, again, equilibrium between two key aspects: sabr on the one hand, patience, and tawakkul, trusting God, with the other. And you can see there are a lot of equilibriums that we are seeking in Islamic psychology. And that is really one of the key points. So if we want to take one key learning that we got from each of these schools, we could say that in psychoanalysis, while our idea of the qalb is good, the idea of the id or the ich is very bad. So the overall idea of the person is very different. From behaviorism, we have seen that the human being is not a tabula rasa, meaning a blank slate, but actually has predispositions and has already an identity when it comes into this world. In humanistic therapy, we have seen that ubudiyya, so their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is a radical alternative to acceptance. In CBT, we have expanded the idea of not just changing thoughts that are maladaptive, but everything, like being open to the fact of improving in every side of ourselves. In existential psychotherapy, we do not prepare for death, but for after death. And in psychodynamic, we live the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wherever we are, but not with anxiety and with the taste for the occult, but with an understanding informed by the Quran. In dialectical behavioral therapy, we take accountability as a step beyond simple mindfulness. And in acceptance and commitment therapy, we reflect that sabr and patience is much easier if we are sure that we will receive a reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rather than not. So these are some of what we can gain insight comparing Islamic psychology with Western school. But if we still do not have clear what Islamic psychology is, this is a summary. That's a definition that one of my shuyukh gave me that I think is the best definition of what Islamic psychology is be with what is and be with Allah. So if you want a definition of the field, that's what it is. But be with what is requires a lot of flexibility from us as Muslim psychologists, because not everything of what is pleasant. Sometimes what is repeated sin, is trauma, is abuse, is horrible stuff, is disobedience. And sometimes, either towards ourselves or towards the other, we are not forgiving and we're not able to go further than this block. And in our own tradition, and of course there are many different paths to it, but poetry, I think, is a good way to understand it. And this is a poetry from Abu Sa'id, a poet from the year 1000. And he wrote, "Come whoever you are, this is not a house of despair. If you have broken your vow 1,000 times, we don't care. Lover of living, a doubtful one, come wherever you are, come and yet again come." So this is not poetry on psychology. Yeah, this is attributed to Rumi, but it's not. It's just near where he's buried on a tile, but it's not written by him. But still, this is a very deep wisdom at whichever level one takes it. And it's more psychological than theological, the way we're saying it. So if we want to improve, or if we want to help people, depending on why we're studying psychology, we need to accept mistakes and then reorient ourselves. But how can we reorient ourselves? Where are we orienting? And actually, we will see in the course of Islamic psychology, the whole science of the levels of the nafs. This is just one of the paradigms that we have. This is nafs al-ammara, nafs al-lawama, nafs al-mutma'inna, things that you know if you know the Quran, these terms. But in Islamic psychology, they become an actual map of who you are. Problem is, there isn't just the nafs, there's the qalb, there is the ruh, everything has its levels, everything has its sickness, and everything needs an equilibrium. So this gets long and complicated, but inshallah, we will be able to do all of it. So I wanted to conclude with a thank you. And this is a piece of art which is called Follow or I Went. And this is mixed media in which a person basically writes everything that they do every day. And after a while, this becomes a piece of art and is published in a limited copy. And this is a thank you, meaning that I hope that I was able to convey how Islamic psychology can radically change everyday activities. So even a collection of random things that we do every day, after we gain knowledge of Islamic psychology, can become really the story that brings us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the meaning of our life, and can really make sense out of all the things that happen daily. And I think this is something radically new for the approach that we have in life, and is something that inshallah can be of benefit to the ummah. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for that absolutely fascinating presentation, that taster, Dr. Francesca. Thank you so much. Really looking forward to this outstanding course. I think it's a unique opportunity online, and we're very honored on Blogging Theology Academy that you're hosting this. And inshallah, it will be a great blessing to us all, especially the Ummah at large. So thank you also to Ahmed for fielding those questions so well. And I will close the session now. Thank you very much, everyone. Please email us if you have any further questions. Email our student services at the email address you've been given in the chat already. So that's it, folks. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, and see you soon.
To all of you. Thanks a lot.
Assalamu alaikum.